Imagine you happen to build a garden that could feed your family without synthetic fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation timers, tractors, or even metal farming tools. The garden would need to survive heat, drought, heavy rain, weeds, insects, and of course, hungry wildlife. It would also need to produce food that could be stored through the winter, and if one crop struggled, the entire system could not be allowed to collapse. Long before modern agriculture, indigenous farmers throughout North America developed sophisticated ways of growing food under wildly different conditions. From one's dry southwest to the forests in the northeast to the river valleys in the Great Plains, there wasn't a single Native American garden. Hundreds of distinct regions developed their own crops, planting patterns, water management systems, and land care traditions. But one agricultural farming system became especially well known for its simplicity, efficiency, and resilience. Today, it is more commonly called the Three Sisters Garden. Corn, beans, and squash were grown together so that each crop performed a different job. The corn grew upward, the beans climbed around it, and the squash spread across the ground beneath them. It looked like a simple garden, but it functioned more like a small ecosystem. For many indigenous communities, these plants were more than an efficient combination of crops. They were connected to community, ceremony, identity stories, and relationship with the land. How did this system work? And it could build its basic principles to still help gardeners and landowners today. Now, I've talked about this in another video, but this is solely about the three sisters themselves. First, you need to look at the problems the garden was designed to solve. Every garden needs sunlight, water, nutrients, space, and protection. It's a conventional garden, but we often provide things separately. We build a trellis for climbing plants. We spread mulch to cover bare soil. We add fertilizer when plants need nutrients. We pull weeds, install irrigation, and sometimes spray crops to control pests. The Three Sisters approach combine all these three functions in one planting. Instead of every crop competing for exactly the same space, plants occupy different levels of the garden. Corn used the vertical space, beans climbed through the middle, squash covered the ground that allowed three food producing crops to grow within the same general area. Now, the first sister was corn. We talk about that because for many indigenous agricultural communities, corn was a major staple crop. And it was traditional corn grown in these gardens, not necessarily the tender sweet corn most of us people eat today at summer cookouts. Many varieties were flint corn, flour corn, and other types that could be allowed to mature fully on the stalk. Once dry, the kernels could be later stored or later ground, boiled, roasted, or prepared in different dishes that made it extremely valuable as a survival crop. Fresh vegetables may last for days or even weeks, but properly dried grain can remain useful for much longer. And that's and also forget about the benefit it has for your animals. It's animal feed. Corn also creates a physical structure for the garden as it grows taller and naturally provides support for climbing beans that reduce the need to cut wood, build a separate trellis, or carry additional materials into the field. Corn was not just providing food, it was performing its second job as garden infrastructure. The second sister was bean. Climbing beans could wind around the corn and grow upward towards the sunlight. Like corn, beans could be eaten at different stages, but dry beans were practically important because they could be harvested after maturing, dried, and stored for future meals. Beans also belong to the legume family, so you're learning stuff, not just the history lessons. Legumes work with bacteria associated with their roots to convert atmospheric nitrogen, that's nitrogen in the air, into forms of connected to the soil system. So the process is one reason why legumes are frequently used in crop rotations and soil building practices. You may hear people professing that the system is described though as beans instantly fertilize the corn during the same season. Reality is a little bit more complicated as much of the nitrogen associated with the living bean plant remains in it while it grows. The soil becomes a benefit when more significant roots and the plant material are left behind to decompose rather than being completely removed. So think once the beans are done, you leave them in the soil and it actually returns the nitrogen through decomposition. Even without treatment, the bean as a bag of instant fertilizer, it does contribute to the overall system. It produces protein rich food, Used as a vertical support for the corn, it occupies a different growth pattern and actually can contribute to organic matter to the soil. The third sister, squash. While corn and beans grow upward, squash vines spread horizontally across the garden. Their broad leaves shade the soil beneath them, and that shade could slow the evaporation of moisture, reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the competing weeds, and protect exposed soil from some of the actual direct impact of heavy rain. Squash, therefore, served a role similar to living mulch. Instead of spreading straw, wood chips, or other material around the garden, the farmer grew a crop that covered the soil while also producing food. Some squash plants had already had coarse and prickly stems and leaves. This dense growth could be a little bit more difficult for certain animals to move casually through the plant or the planting row, although it did not create an impenetrable barrier, and once again, storage was critical. Winter squash and pumpkins could remain edible for months. When harvested mature, and cured correctly and kept under suitable conditions. That gave the gardener three major categories of storageable food. Dried corn provided carbohydrates, dried beans provided protein and additional nutrients, and winter squash supplied energy, vitamins, seeds, and variety. Together, they created a much more useful food supply than any one crop could provide alone. That's the strength of a survival garden. Also, you want to check out my video about the Vikings because it talks about how to create a garden that works in all unison and everything gets put to use. I also did a video on zucchinis and what to do with them as they're related to squash, as there are many uses that you can do for having that much zucchini and squash, which you're going to have. Trust me, that video will help you out. Remember that corn was always planted first in this three sister process, going back to it. Don't let me always give me some time to plug my own videos, allowing it time to become established. Beans were added after the corn had grown up enough to serve as support, and squash was planted around or between the hills. Now remember, timing was important. You don't want to plant all three simultaneously, and a bean grows faster than a young corn stalk can support. It can pull the corn downward before the stalk becomes strong, and the corn therefore needs a head start. The choice of varieties matters as well. A short, modern sweet corn variety may not be strong enough to support a heavy pole bean. A highly aggressive bean may overwhelm the corn. A compact bush squash may not provide the same ground coverage as a vigorous winter squash vine. The original system depended on generations of practical knowledge involving particular seeds, local weather, soil conditions, and spacing and planting dates. They all mattered. It was not merely a matter of throwing three random seed packets on the same hole. The distinction is important for anyone who wants to reproduce a garden today. The principle is simple, but the success requires a little observation. Traditional growers know which varieties work together because that knowledge has been developed, tested, and passed down between generations. Seeds themselves carry that part of knowledge too. Farmers save seeds from plants that perform well under local conditions. You might want to think about that. Over many generations and growing seasons too. That favorite crops that could handle the area's climate, rainfall, soil, pest, and seasonal patterns. A locally adapted seed was not just another seed, it represented years of potentially generations of selection. This was another valuable lesson for modern landowners. A variety that produces large harvests under commercial conditions may not be the best variety for your individual property. A slightly less productive plant that reliably survives through the heat, drought, humidity, insects, and short growing season may be far more valuable. Resilience is not always about achieving the largest possible harvest. I want you to keep that in mind. It's about achieving dependable harvests under imperfect condition. Indigenous agricultural systems also extended far beyond corn, squash, and beans. Different communities cultivated sunflowers, tobacco, amaranth, peppers, gourds, and many other useful plants. And I'm not telling you to go out here and build a whole, the Great Plains. I just want you to know that a lot of cultures maintain extensive agriculture conditions along the upper Missouri River. Gardens could include corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, and crops selected and managed for local condition. Southwest ancestral Pueblo farmers faced a completely different challenge. Rainfall could be limited and unpredictable. And instead of assuming the water would always come directly, they studied how the water moved across the landscape. Fields could be positioned to receive runoff from higher ground, stones, small barriers and terraces, check dams, and other Landscape features could slow the water, reducing erosion and concentrate moisture near crops. Farmers also planted in local areas where the soil depth, slope, shade, and natural drainage improved the chances for success. The goal was not always bring in unlimited water to your garden, but also make it better use for water that was already available. That required a detailed understanding of your property. Where did the rainwater collect? Which areas dried first? Which slope received the most intense afternoon sun? Where did the cold air settle? Where had sediment created deeper soil? Modern landowners don't ask these questions, but they may need to because it'll teach you how to actually grow on your own land. Garden or your orchid, a pond, a swale, or a food plot. The technology may change, but the importance of observations does not changed with many indigenous communities. Farming was combined with hunting, fishing, gathering, and management of forests, grassland, wetland, and other ecosystems. Now, you don't need a degree in botany. You just need to understand that a farm field was not expected to provide every item the community needed. Wild plants provided fruits, nuts, and grains and medicines, fibers, dyes, and building materials. Rivers and lakes provided fish and aquatic resources. This created a diversified food system rather than a total dependence on one single field. If one area produced poorly, say your field, another part of the landscape might still provide fish, nuts, berries, roots, or game. So that's how the Vikings lived. True, same way like Native Americans. The survival garden, therefore, did not exist in isolation. Labor behind these gardens was organized. Many agricultural nations, women held extensive knowledge of seeds, planting, cultivation, harvesting, preparation, and storage. Work could be performed by families, organized groups, depending on the community and task. Larger fields allow people to produce not only food for immediate consumption, but also surpluses. And surpluses could be dried, stored, shared, and used during crop failures and traded with other communities. Storage transformed a seasonal harvest into long term security. Corn could be dried on a cob or removed from it. Beans were allowed to mature and dry. Squash could be cured and stored whole, while parts of the crop could also be cut and dried. Seeds were preserved for the next planting season. And remember, this you can do on your own land today. This required discipline, though, because seed supply could not simply be eaten during the winter without threatening or following the year's garden schedule. A successful harvest therefore had several destinations a household could recover from losing a meal. Losing its adopted seed supply could affect many future harvests or practical methods for protecting fields. Raised platforms or watcher stages could be placed near gardens so people could watch for birds, animals attempting to eat their crops. Fences, fields, and field placement for human activity in gardens, dense growth could provide additional protection, but no historical garden was completely maintenance free. The three sister system will still require planting, thinning, weeding, watching, harvesting, processing, and storage. We talked about that. Calling it a perfect survival garden does not mean it magically care for itself. It was the brilliance that was much of the labor produced more than one benefit. Corn supplied food, and support beans supplied the food while the corn was using the corn as a trellis. Squash supplied food and ground cover. Crop residues could return organic material to the soil. The plant used the vertical and horizontal space. Remember, growing up and growing out. The harvest included foods that could be stored and combined in substantial meals. Every part of the garden had a purpose. That's just how the Vikings did it, the same way. So, what could someone with a modern garden or a small property learn from the system? The first is grow crops that work together rather than thinking about every crop separately. That doesn't mean every companion claim on this internet is true, and physical relationships are real. A deep rooted plant may use a different layer of the soil than a shallow rooted one. Remember that. The second lesson is to prioritize storage crops. A survival garden filled with entirely lettuce, cucumbers, and tomatoes may produce a wonderful summer harvest, but much of that food must be eaten or properly processed and very quickly. Dry beans, grains, corn, winter squash, potatoes, sweet potatoes, onions, and other storage crops extend the value of a garden beyond the harvest day. The third lesson is to use to be more or it's more useful to have more than one layer of space. A property has ground space, vertical space, edges, shaded areas, wet areas, slopes, transition zones. Not every plant needs to occupy the same level. The fourth lesson is to select varieties on your actual climate. I've done climate zone videos. Go back to them and I'll link them in the description section below. Because a garden in Kentucky is not managed the same way as a garden in Arizona or coastal Oregon. Rainfall, summer heat, humidity, and pest pressure all change what you will work. The fifth lesson is to save your seeds, which I've actually started doing now, and pay attention to which plants perform the best. Saving seeds can actually connect a garden more closely to its location. And finally, the most important lesson right now is diversification. Grow foods with different harvest dates, different growth patterns, nutritional roles, and storage lives. Use the broader property for more than one purpose. Now, I'm going to tell you this one thing, right? A survival garden doesn't have to be merely food produced when the conditions are perfect. It should continue providing options when something goes wrong. Remember how we talked about Native Americans did not just have one field that didn't work, they went to something else, the rivers, the forests. And again, it's not a trick or a primitive thing to substitute for modern farming. It's accumulative environmental knowledge developed by communities and carefully observed water, soil, plants, wildlife, weather, and seasons. Three Sisters Gardens remains one of the clearest examples of that knowledge. Three crops, three different growth patterns, three completely different roles. Corn reaching upward, beans climbing right after them, and squash protecting the ground below. Simple enough. Now, if you like this video, give me the HMO special, help me out, and make sure you like, share, subscribe. Comment below and tell me what other combinations have worked for you. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I'm Phil Davis, signing off, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Most people don't need motivation, they need better information. Owning land, growing food, and becoming more self reliant often sound complicated, mostly because they're rarely explained clearly. Ancestry Lands focuses on the practical side of independence by talking about what land ownership actually costs, what works in real backyards and small parcels. Because independence means getting freedom and security, and land just happens to do both. If you prefer planning over panic, subscribe to Ancestry Lands for information you can actually use.